Okay, let's unpack this. You are, you're probably currently staring down a massive, intimidating stack of notes for AP Human Geography Unit 2.
Oh, yeah. The dreaded Unit 2.
Right. We are talking about population and migration patterns and processes. And if you are feeling a little overwhelmed by the sheer volume of material in front of you, the models, the math, the historical case studies, take a deep breath.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Because you are in exactly the right place. We are going to break this entire matrix down together, and we are going to make it stick. I want to highlight the stakes for you right out of the gate here. This single unit, this one specific stack of notes, accounts for a massive 12 to 17% of the AP exam in May.
Which is huge.
It's massive.
Yeah.
Mastering this material is the ultimate shortcut to a passing score. It is the foundation for almost everything else you're going to learn in this course.
And what's fascinating here is that when you look at those notes, it's very easy to just see a list of vocabulary words.
Yeah.
Or, a bunch of dry mathematical formulas.
Flashcards.
Exactly, just flashcards to memorize. But that is not what this unit is actually about. It is about seeing the underlying code of human existence. Every single data point, every single demographic model we are going to explore today represents real, tangible human behavior.
I love that.
When we look at these models, we're looking at the invisible architecture of why massive megacities grow, why certain national economies are just destined to collapse, why political borders change, and why global resources are distributed the way they are.
I love that framing. It's not just math, it's the story of us. So for you listening, here is our guiding question. The mission for today's deep dive. How do population patterns and migration flows shape economic development, political power, and social change?
That's the big one.
I want you to keep that specific question in the back of your mind as we go through every single concept today. To make this beast of a unit manageable, we are going to look at it through 4 distinct lenses.
The 4 slices.
Right. We're going to start with the where and the why of human settlement. Then we'll look at the math, how we track and predict the speed at which we are growing.
That's the models section.
Exactly. From there, we'll explore what happens when governments panic and try to control that growth. And finally, we'll unpack why people pack up their entire lives and move across the globe.
It's the perfect progression, because if we connect this to the bigger picture, you will see how each one of those concepts acts as a domino that knocks over the next. The natural environment dictates where we settle. That settlement creates population growth.
Right.
That growth forces societal and political intervention. And those interventions, or the failures of those interventions, push people to migrate. It is one continuous, unbroken chain of cause and effect.
Let's jump into that first domino. I'm looking at my notes on where people actually live on this planet, and there's a statistic here that honestly broke my brain a little bit.
The 5% rule.
Yes. We have over 8 billion people currently alive on Earth. But we are all crammed onto just 5% of the Earth's surface. Just 5%.
It is a staggering reality to visualize, and there is a highly testable AP vocabulary term for that 5%, the ecumen.
Ecumen.
Right. The ecumen is the portion of the Earth's surface that is permanently settled by human beings. It is the habitable zone. When you look at a globe, it seems vast, but when you strip away the oceans, the massive unlivable deserts, the frozen tundras, and the sheer mountain ranges, you are left with a surprisingly tiny sliver of prime real estate.
So if we are packed into that 5%, where exactly is everyone hanging out? Because it's clearly not an even spread.
Not at all. We see extreme spatial clustering. Nearly 2/3 of the entire global population is concentrated in just 4 major regional clusters.
Okay, let's list them.
You have South Asia, which includes India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. You have Southeast Asia, encompassing places like Indonesia and the Philippines. You have East Asia, dominated by Eastern China and Japan. And then you have the European cluster.
Okay, so the obvious question is, why there? What is so special about those 4 specific spots on the map? It seems like it comes down to a mix of Mother Nature and human choices, right?
Exactly. We categorize these as physical factors and human factors. Let's start with the physical, because the environment essentially dictates the baseline of human survival. Humans overwhelmingly gravitate toward the mid-latitudes.
Which is where on the globe?
This is the geographic sweet spot, roughly between 30 and 60 degrees north and south of the equator. The climates in these zones are milder, the seasons are somewhat predictable, and most importantly, the precipitation is reliable enough to support large-scale agriculture.
Right, because if you can't grow food, you can't have a city. You aren't going to find massive, sprawling metropolitan population clusters in the middle of the Sahara Desert or the deep freeze of northern Canada.
Precisely. And tied to that is the concept of landforms. People naturally settle in lowlands. If you want to build a civilization, it is infinitely easier to lay down roads, construct buildings, and plow massive fields on flat ground.
Yeah, mountains are tough.
Mountainous regions naturally repel dense settlement because the terrain is unforgiving, the soil is often rocky and poor, and the air is thinner.
Although my notes do mention a really interesting exception to that mountain rule.
Yes, the high-altitude exception near the equator. In places like Mexico City or certain Andean cities in South America, the sweltering, humid lowlands are actually quite uncomfortable and very prone to tropical diseases. So populations deliberately settled in higher altitude regions where the climate is cooler and more temperate.
Makes total sense.
But beyond climate and elevation, the absolute non-negotiable physical factor is water.
I mean, that's just basics. Every great ancient civilization we learn about, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, they're all built on rivers.
And that hasn't changed in the modern era. Whether it's for basic drinking water, massive agricultural irrigation, or global maritime trade, the vast majority of human populations today in Eurasia, Australia, and the Americas remain tightly clustered along coastlines and major river systems. Access to water is access to life and wealth.
Okay, so the physical factors make total sense. We go where it's flat, where it's warm but not too warm, and where there is water. But human factors are just as powerful in determining where we live, aren't they?
In many ways, they are even more complex. Economic opportunity is the ultimate human magnet. Settlement patterns naturally follow resource availability and job markets. Think about the historical gold rushes or the modern oil boom towns in North Dakota. Where there is capital to be made, humans will flock there.
Right.
Culturally, people are drawn to areas that offer robust amenities, things like specialized universities, world-class healthcare facilities, or vibrant art scenes.
There is also just the sheer weight of history, too. I'm thinking about cities like London or Beijing. They've been massive population centers for centuries.
That is historical momentum. Once a major hub is established, it tends to attract continuous settlement simply because the infrastructure, the ports, the roads, the housing is already there. It is easier to plug into an existing grid than to build a new one from scratch in the wilderness.
But I want to talk about the political side of human factors.
Right.
Because this is where governments start playing chess with human lives. My notes mention that politics can forcefully alter population distribution.
It can, and often with brutal efficiency. A classic historical example for the exam is the mid-20th century Soviet Union. The Soviet government wanted to extract the massive natural resources, timber, minerals, oil located in Siberia.
Which is famously freezing.
Exactly. The physical environment of Siberia is incredibly hostile. It's freezing, remote, and naturally unappealing for settlement. So the government utilized forced political mandates, moving hundreds of thousands of Russians out to these remote, freezing outposts. The physical factor said, do not live here, but the political mandate overrode nature to artificially alter the country's population distribution for economic gain.
That is wild. Okay, so all of that covers the distribution. But I want to pivot to density, the how many. And this is where I think a lot of people, including myself, get tripped up. Because when I think of density, I just think total number of people divided by the size of the country. But my notes say that is a trap.
It is absolutely a trap, and the AP exam loves to test this distinction. What you just described is arithmetic density.
Wow.
It is basic math, the total population divided by the total land area. It gives you a very broad, generalized average of population pressure.
So why is it a trap?
Because it assumes that every single square mile of a country is equally habitable, which we just established is completely false. Think about Egypt.
Okay.
If you calculate Egypt's arithmetic density, it looks incredibly low. It looks like everyone has plenty of wide open space. But in reality, roughly 95% of Egypt's population lives on just 5% of the land, crammed along the thin green ribbon of the Nile River and its delta. The rest of the country is the uninhabitable Sahara Desert. So using arithmetic density gives you a dangerously misleading picture of how crowded Egypt actually is.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So what is the better metric? How do we actually measure the pressure on the land?
That is where geographers turn to physiological density. This is a crucial concept. Physiological density is the total population divided by the total arable land.
Arable meaning land that is actually suitable for farming.
Exactly.
So you're entirely throwing out the deserts and the mountains from the math.
You are. You're only looking at the land that can produce food. This metric is incredibly revealing because it shows you the intense, localized pressure a population places on its food supply. Going back to our Egypt example, their arithmetic density is low, but their physiological density is astronomical. They have a massive population relying on a very tiny sliver of farmable land.
And that single metric explains so much about global politics. It explains why Egypt views any upstream dams built by Ethiopia on the Nile as a literal existential threat. If you mess with that arable land or its water source, millions of people starve.
Spot on. That is the exact kind of cause and effect critical thinking you need for this exam. Now, there is a third type of density to know: agricultural density. This is the number of farmers divided by the total arable land.
Wait, why do we care about the ratio of farmers to land? Doesn't that just tell us about farming?
It actually tells us about a country's technological and economic development. Think about it. If a country has a very low agricultural density, it means very few farmers are managing massive amounts of land and feeding a huge population. How is that possible?
Machines, tractors, industrial fertilizers, automated irrigation.
Exactly. Low agricultural density is a hallmark of highly developed industrialized economies like the United States or Canada. They have the capital to invest in technology, so they don't need a massive human labor force sweating in the fields.
Right.
Conversely, a high agricultural density suggests a developing economy. It means you have millions of people engaged in intensive manual subsistence farming just to survive.
So, bringing this all together, why does this matter to you, the listener? Why do we care if people are clustered tightly in cities with low agricultural density or spread out across rural areas?
Because where people live directly dictates power, representation, and money. Let's look at the political consequences first. In a democratic system, political representation is intrinsically tied to population distribution.
Right. I'm thinking about the United States Census, which happens every 10 years.
The U.S. Census is much more than a headcount. It is the constitutional mechanism for reapportionment. The U.S. House of Representatives has a fixed number of seats, and those seats are allocated to states based on their population.
Okay.
So if a massive demographic shift occurs, say, over the course of a decade, hundreds of thousands of people pack up and move from the cold Northeast down to the sunny Sunbelt states in the South and West, the political power literally moves with them across the map.
The states losing people actually lose congressional seats and electoral college votes.
Yes. And the gaining states increase their political influence in Washington. This triggers a localized process called redistricting, where state legislatures have to redraw the geographic boundaries of voting districts to reflect the new population reality. So, human movement directly alters the political landscape.
And economic power follows that exact same gravity. Money follows density. Businesses aren't going to open a massive tech hub or a super hospital in a region where the population is shrinking.
The compounding effect of distribution is undeniable. Governments and private corporations allocate their investments based on where the taxpayers and consumers are. Dense urban areas receive prioritized funding for new infrastructure, fiber optic internet, light rail systems, advanced hospitals, and elite schools, because that investment serves the maximum number of people.
Which leaves the shrinking areas out in the cold. I'm looking at the notes on the Rust Belt in the United States. Starting in the 1950s and 60s, as manufacturing jobs started moving overseas, massive populations fled industrial cities in places like Ohio and Michigan.
And as the people left, the tax base evaporated. Suddenly, those cities didn't have the revenue to maintain the massive infrastructure they built during their boom years. Schools close, hospitals consolidate, and public transit is defunded. It creates a downward economic spiral triggered entirely by a shift in population density.
But the notes also make it clear that ultra-dense urbanization isn't some perfect utopia either. When you pack millions of people into a megacity, the environmental strain is terrifying.
It is immense. High-density areas demand astronomical amounts of energy, clean water, and food to be imported daily, while simultaneously generating mountains of waste and severe air pollution. Which brings us to a massive, overarching geographic debate, the concept of carrying capacity.
Carrying capacity is the maximum population size an environment can sustain indefinitely without suffering ecological collapse, right?
Correct. And the debate is whether the Earth as a whole has already exceeded its carrying capacity, or if human ingenuity can figure out a way to sustain 9, 10, or even 11 billion people.
I feel like I see articles about this every week. Are we running out of space? Are we running out of water?
What's crucial to understand is that the crux of the carrying capacity problem isn't just a raw headcount, it is consumption variance.
What does that mean, consumption variance?
It means that not all humans consume resources at the same rate. A wealthy middle-class family in a highly developed nation consumes natural resources, electricity, meat, petroleum, plastics, at an exponentially higher rate than a family living in a developing agrarian nation.
Oh, wow.
If all 8 billion people on Earth consumed resources at the rate of an average American, we would need multiple planets to sustain us. So the pressure on global resources is severely unbalanced by how developed our economies are.
That is a sobering thought. And it leads us perfectly into the next major concept, population composition. We spent all this time talking about where people are and how many there are. Now we need to look at who they are. And the ultimate cheat sheet for this is a visual tool called the population pyramid.
If there is one visual graphic you must intimately understand for this exam, it is the population pyramid. It is essentially a bar graph turned on its side. The vertical y-axis plots age groups, usually in 5-year cohorts, so ages 0 to 4, 5 to 9, all the way up to 85 plus.
Okay.
The horizontal x-axis shows the percentage or total number of the population split by sex, typically with males on the left and females on the right.
So by looking at the resulting shape of these bars stacked on top of each other, you can basically read a country's fortune.
Exactly. A geographer can look at a population pyramid and instantly diagnose the country's past traumas, its current demographic health, and predict its future economic crises.
Okay, let's visualize the 3 main shapes you need to know. First, imagine a pyramid with a super wide, heavy base at the bottom, and it sharply narrows into a tiny point at the top. What does that tell us?
That is a rapid growth pyramid. The extremely wide base tells you that the country has a massive birth rate. There are millions of babies and young children. But the fact that it sharply tapers off as you go up the age brackets indicates a lower life expectancy and a high death rate.
What's a real-world example of this?
Many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, currently exhibit this shape. From an exam perspective, what you need to understand are the immediate challenges this shape presents. A country with a rapid growth pyramid is under immense pressure to build pediatric hospitals, massive school systems, and childcare infrastructure. And looking ahead 15 years, they are going to need millions of new entry-level jobs when all those children hit the labor market simultaneously.
Okay, shape number 2. What if the graph doesn't really look like a pyramid at all? What if it looks more like a column or a block? The bars for the children, the young adults, and the middle-aged folks are all roughly the same width, only tapering off at the very oldest ages.
That shape indicates slow or stable growth. This is characteristic of highly developed nations like the United States. The birth rates have lowered to a point where they roughly match the death rates. The population isn't exploding, but it isn't shrinking either. The societal challenge here is maintaining economic equilibrium, ensuring you have enough consistent tax revenue from the working age population to support the stable cohorts of youth and elderly.
Which brings us to the third shape, which looks like an upside-down pyramid or maybe a kite. It has a very narrow base, it bulges out in the middle for the working-age adults, and remains relatively wide at the top.
This is a declining population pyramid. The extremely narrow base means the birth rate has plummeted, people are having very few children. The wider top means the life expectancy is very high, so you have a massive elderly population.
Countries like Germany or Japan.
Yes. And the primary terrifying challenge for these countries is a looming labor and economic crisis. You simply have more retirees exiting the workforce than you have young people entering it to replace them.
And that specific dynamic is measured by one of the most important concepts in this entire unit, the dependency ratio. Listeners, highlight this in your notes. The dependency ratio is the mathematical formula that tells you exactly how much economic pressure is bearing down on the working-age population.
It is a critical metric. The formula divides a society into 2 groups, the dependent population and the productive population. Dependents are universally defined as anyone under the age of 15 who are too young to work and anyone over the age of 65 who have retired. The productive working-age population is everyone in between, from 15 to 64.
So you add up all the kids and all the retirees, and you compare them to the people actually holding down jobs and paying income tax.
Exactly. You divide the number of dependents by the working-age population and multiply by 100 to get a ratio. If we connect this to the bigger picture, a high dependency ratio is a giant, flashing economic red flag.
Let's build a hypothetical scenario so we can really see this. Imagine a small town of 100 people. If 60 of those people are either little kids or retired seniors, and only 40 of them are working-age adults, that means those 40 workers are carrying the entire society on their backs.
That is exactly the pressure. Those 40 workers have to generate all the economic output, and they are bearing a massive tax burden. Their taxes have to fund the local schools and pediatricians for the youth, while simultaneously funding the pensions, the nursing homes, and the specialized health care for the elderly. It is a mathematical vice grip. A high dependency ratio almost guarantees future economic stagnation or a collapse of social safety nets unless the government drastically intervenes.
Speaking of government intervention altering a population pyramid, we cannot talk about population composition without analyzing one of the most famous historical case studies in modern geography, China's one-child policy. Now, we're looking at this strictly impartially, solely focusing on the demographic data, the structural mechanics of the policy, and its long-term effects on their population pyramid.
Analytically speaking, the policy, which ran from roughly 1979 to 2015, was enacted because the Chinese government feared their rapid population growth was going to outstrip the nation's carrying capacity and derail their economic modernization. The state decided to forcefully mandate an antinatalist policy, legally restricting most families to a single child.
And from a raw data perspective, it did work. It prevented hundreds of millions of births and altered their growth trajectory. But the collateral damage to their population composition was incredibly severe, particularly regarding something called the sex ratio.
The sex ratio is the proportion of males to females in a population. The natural biological global sex ratio is roughly 105 boys born for every 100 girls, which generally evens out to about 101 to 100 in adulthood due to slightly higher male mortality rates.
But in China, during this policy, that ratio became drastically skewed.
Extremely skewed. Because Chinese culture historically placed a higher social and economic value on male heirs, males were expected to carry on the family name, perform heavy agrarian labor, and care for aging parents. The restriction of a single child led to an intense cultural pressure to ensure that one child was a boy. As a result, female infants were frequently aborted, abandoned, or hidden from state registries. The official sex ratio skewed dramatically, sometimes reaching 115 or 120 males for every 100 females.
So you have a generation with tens of millions of surplus men who mathematically cannot find female partners to marry and start families with. That is a massive social disruption. Let's look at how this policy warped their population pyramid. If you look at China's pyramid today, it doesn't look natural. It looks like someone took a massive bite out of the bottom left and right sides.
That missing chunk at the base represents the decades of restricted births. And here is where the dominoes fall. That artificially narrowed small base is now moving up the pyramid as those single children age into their 20s and 30s. They are becoming the working age cohort. Meanwhile, the massive larger cohorts of people born before the policy was enacted are now moving into their 60s and 70s.
Oh, wow. So they engineered their own dependency ratio crisis.
Exactly. China is now staring down the barrel of a rapidly aging population supported by a shrinking workforce. It is often referred to as the 4-2-1 problem. You have one single child in the workforce who is solely responsible for supporting 2 aging parents and 4 aging grandparents. The economic strain of that demographic reality is immense.
That is a perfect, somewhat terrifying encapsulation of how all these concepts interlock. And that brings us to the end of our first analytical lens, the geography of settlement. We understand the where and the who. Now we need to look at the how fast. We are moving into our second slice, tracking and predicting growth. This covers your notes for topics 2.4 through 2.6. And listeners, grab your mental calculators because we have to unpack the specific math you will absolutely need for the exam.
To understand population dynamics, we essentially need to measure 3 distinct variables: fertility, mortality, and migration. How many people are being born, how many are dying, and how many are moving in or out.
Let's start with fertility, the birth side of the equation. I'm seeing 2 different acronyms here, CBR and TFR. Let's define the crude birth rate first.
The crude birth rate, or CBR, is the most basic metric. It is simply the total number of live births in a year for every 1,000 people alive in the society. So if a country has a CBR of 20, it means 20 babies were born for every 1,000 citizens that year.
But the notes specifically call it crude for a reason. It's considered a flawed, or at least a very blunt, instrument. Why is that?
It is crude because it compares the number of births to the entire population. That denominator of 1,000 people includes young children, elderly retirees, and men, none of whom are biologically capable of giving birth. So it doesn't isolate the actual demographic that matters for fertility.
It's like trying to calculate a baseball player's batting average by including the times he was sitting on the bench eating sunflower seeds. It dilutes the stat.
That's a great analogy. And that is exactly why geographers and demographers vastly prefer the second metric, the total fertility rate, or TFR.
TFR is the golden metric.
It is. The TFR measures the average number of children a woman will have during her childbearing years, which is globally standardized as ages 15 to 49. It isolates the specific demographic capable of reproduction, giving us a much more precise look at a society's actual fertility behavior.
And there is a magic number associated with TFR that every AP student needs burned into their memory.
Yes, 2.1.
Why 2.1? What does that fraction of a child mean?
2.1 is known as the replacement level fertility. Think of it this way. It takes two parents to create a child. If those two parents have exactly two children over their lifetime, they have perfectly replaced themselves in the population when they eventually pass away.
So why the 0.1? Why not just 2.0?
The 0.1 accounts for natural statistical attrition. It accounts for infant mortality children who tragically do not survive to adulthood, as well as individuals who choose not to have children or are unable to reproduce. So an average of 2.1 children per woman ensures the population remains perfectly stable, neither growing nor shrinking.
Okay, let's look at how wildly that number varies across the globe today. My notes show that sub-Saharan Africa currently averages a TFR of about 4.6.
A TFR of 4.6 indicates explosive, rapid, multi-generational growth. Women are having more than double the number of children needed for replacement.
But then you look at Europe and their average TFR is 1.6.
Which means they are well below replacement level, their populations are naturally contracting, and it gets even more extreme. Certain regions like South Korea or Puerto Rico are currently hovering around a TFR of 0.8 or 0.9. Demographers refer to this as death spiral demographics. The fertility rate is so profoundly low that the population is facing severe compounding contraction that is incredibly difficult to reverse.
So that is the birth side. On the flip side, we have mortality, the death side of the equation. We measure this with the crude death rate, the CDR.
Similar to the CBR, the crude death rate is the total number of deaths in a year for every 1,000 people alive in the society. Globally, the CDR has dropped significantly over the last 60 years. We've seen it fall from about 13 deaths per 1,000 people down to roughly 8 per 1,000.
What's driving that massive global drop?
It is a combination of the agricultural revolution providing better daily nutrition, massive global investments in clean water and sanitation infrastructure, and the widespread distribution of basic medical advancements like antibiotics and vaccines.
But again, that's a global average. National variance is huge. And to really judge the health of a nation, we have to look at another highly testable acronym, the IMR, or infant mortality rate.
The infant mortality rate is perhaps the most tragic but revealing statistic in geography. It measures how many children die before reaching their first birthday, calculated per 1,000 live births.
Why is that specific metric so important for the exam?
Because a higher IMR is a glaring, undeniable indicator that a region lacks foundational infrastructure. It means pregnant women do not have access to prenatal care, hospitals lack basic sanitation or pediatric resources, and infants are succumbing to easily preventable diseases or malnutrition. If you want to instantly know if a country is highly developed or struggling, look at their infant mortality rate.
Okay, so we have the birth rate and we have the death rate. Now we put them together to find out how fast a country is actually growing. This is the rate of natural increase, the RNI.
The math for the RNI is very simple. It is the crude birth rate minus the crude death rate, usually converted into a percentage.
CBR minus CDR. If the birth rate is higher than the death rate, the number is positive, and the population is naturally growing. If they are equal, the RNI is 0, and the population is stable. If the death rate is higher than the birth rate like we see in parts of Eastern Europe, the RNI is negative, and the population is naturally shrinking.
But here is the critical limitation, the trap that the AP exam loves to lay for students. The rate of natural increase excludes migration. It is purely a measure of biology births minus deaths.
Right. So a country like Germany might have a negative RNI because their citizens aren't having many babies and their elderly population is passing away, but their total overall population might actually still be growing.
Exactly, because their net immigration is exceptionally high. They are importing more people than they are losing naturally. You must remember that RNI is only half the story of a country's actual growth.
And geographers use these rates to calculate something called population doubling time. Literally, how many years will it take for a country to double its current population if the current growth rate stays exactly the same?
The contrasts here are mind-bending. Let's look at Nigeria. Nigeria has a very high RNI, growing at roughly 2.6% annually. At that rate, Nigeria will double its massive population in just 27 years.
That is insane. Imagine your city having to build twice as many roads, twice as many houses, and twice as many schools in less than 3 decades just to keep up. Now, contrast that with the United States.
The United States has an RNI of about 0.3%. At that sluggish pace, it will take the U.S. roughly 233 years to double its population.
Okay, so we have all this math. We can track the exact speed of the demographic train, but numbers in a vacuum are boring. We need a theory to explain why the numbers change the way they do. And that brings us to the absolute giants of AP Human Geography, the models. TAPI 2.5 introduces the demographic transition model and the epidemiological transition model.
If you learn nothing else today, master these two models. The demographic transition model, or the DTM, is the foundational framework for understanding population change over time. The core argument of the DTM is that population changes are deeply, inextricably driven by a country's economic development. Specifically, it tracks the journey a society makes as it transitions from a rural, agrarian, farming society into an urban, industrialized, modern society.
It's basically a timeline with 5 distinct stages.
Right.
Let's walk through the narrative of each stage, because I want the listener to really picture what life is like in these eras. Stage 1 is called high stationary. What does a Stage 1 society look like?
Stage 1 is the pre-industrial, hunter-gatherer, or early subsistence farming era. Think of humanity for the vast majority of our history. Both the birth rates and the death rates are extremely high and erratic.
You're having 8 or 9 children.
Yes, because you need the free labor to work the fields, and frankly, because, half of them might not survive childhood, because the death rate is equally brutal. Disease, famine, animal attacks, and a complete lack of modern medicine kill people rapidly. Life expectancy is terrible. Because high births are perfectly canceled out by high deaths, the total population line on the graph stays very low and completely flat. It is stationary.
Are there any countries in Stage 1 today?
No. Today, there are 0 entire countries still in Stage 1. Only a few isolated, uncontacted indigenous tribes deep in the Amazon or on remote islands might fit this profile.
Okay, so then a society discovers early technology and moves into Stage 2, early expanding.
This is the era of the population explosion. The society experiences the very early stages of industrialization. They build basic sewer systems, discover basic sanitation, and figure out how to transport food more reliably. Suddenly, the death rate plummets. People stop dying of cholera and starvation at massive rates.
The birth rate stays high, right?
Exactly. The death rate falls off a cliff, but cultural and social norms take generations to change. Families are still having 8 children out of tradition, but now, because of better sanitation, all 8 children are surviving to adulthood. This creates a massive gap on the graph between the high birth line and the plummeting death line. That gap represents explosive, exponential population growth.
Historically, this was England during the early 1800s, right at the start of the Industrial Revolution. Where do we see Stage 2 today?
Today, many developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the Middle East are solidly in Stage 2. Their populations are booming.
Then we hit Stage 3, late expanding. The society is modernizing even further.
Stage 3 is defined by massive urbanization. The society transitions from agriculture to manufacturing. Millions of people move from rural farms into dense cities to work in factories.
And when you live in a tiny apartment in a crowded city, having 8 kids is no longer an economic advantage. It's a massive financial liability. You don't need them to milk the cows anymore. You just have to buy them shoes and food.
Precisely. The economic reality shifts, and access to basic contraception and female education begins to improve. So the birth rate begins a rapid, steep decline, finally chasing the death rate downward. The total population is still growing, hence late expanding, but the speed of that growth is slowing down significantly. Many rapidly developing nations like Mexico or India are navigating Stage 3 right now.
Stage 4 is low stationary.
This is your highly developed, fully industrialized, service-based economy. Both birth rates and death rates are very low and stable. Women are highly integrated into the workforce, healthcare is advanced, and having a large family is a rare, expensive lifestyle choice. The population stabilizes with near 0 natural growth. This is the United States, Canada, and most of Western Europe.
And finally, the wild card, Stage 5, natural decrease.
Stage 5 is a relatively new phenomenon. In this stage, the cultural shift away from large families is so profound, and the cost of living in an advanced society is so high that the birth rate drops so low it actually falls below the already low death rate.
Wait, so the death rate is higher than the birth rate?
Yes. The population begins to naturally decline and age rapidly. The graph literally inverts. Japan and parts of Eastern Europe are the textbook examples of countries entering stage 5, and it is causing massive economic panic for their governments.
Now, we have to pair this economic timeline with its sister model, the epidemiological transition model, or the ETM. And this model is fascinating because it maps perfectly onto the 5 stages of the DTM. But instead of tracking economics and urbanization, the ETM tracks the Grim Reaper. It tracks exactly what is killing people in each stage of human development.
The ETM is the medical shadow of the DTM. Let's overlay them. Stage 1 of the ETM is called the Age of Famine and Pestilence. This aligns with the pre-industrial stage 1 of the DTM.
So what's killing us here?
Infectious diseases, violent parasitic infections, and cyclical starvation. Human bodies are incredibly vulnerable to the natural world. Think of the bubonic plague wiping out a third of Europe. Life expectancy is brutal, perhaps hovering around 30 years old.
But then we get basic sanitation, and we move to stage 2 of the ETM, which aligns with the massive population boom. This is the age of receding pandemics.
Right. As societies build enclosed sewers and clean water systems during early industrialization, the massive, devastating pandemics start to pull back. Life expectancy jumps from 30 to maybe 50 years.
But it's not perfect yet.
Yeah.
You still have people crowded into gross, smoggy, early industrial cities.
Exactly. You might still have localized outbreaks of cholera in a crowded London slum because of a contaminated water pump, but the global civilization-ending plagues are losing their grip.
Then we move to stage 3, the age of degenerative and human-created diseases.
This is a profound shift in human history. Because people are no longer dying in their 20s from smallpox or dysentery, they actually live long enough to experience their bodies naturally breaking down. The primary causes of death shift from external infectious bugs to internal chronic diseases associated with aging and modern sedentary lifestyles. We see a massive rise in heart disease, various forms of cancer, and type 2 diabetes.
Stage 4 is delayed degenerative diseases.
Here, society has developed incredibly advanced medical interventions. We invent bypass surgeries, chemotherapy, pacemakers, and daily insulin regimens. We don't necessarily cure the chronic diseases of stage 3, but we learn how to delay their lethal effects for decades. A heart attack in stage 3 was a death sentence. A heart attack in stage 4 is a surgery and a prescription. Life expectancy reaches its absolute peak, pushing into the late 70s and 80s.
But stage 5 of the ETM, this is the one that sounds like the plot of a sci-fi horror movie.
Stage 5 predicts the horrifying reemergence of infectious and parasitic diseases.
Why? We have advanced medicine. We beat the bugs in stage 2.
Because nature fights back. Diseases evolve. The ETM theorizes that decades of overprescribing antibiotics in stage 4 societies causes bacteria to mutate and develop resistance. Combined with intense modern globalization, where a novel pathogen can travel from a remote jungle to the center of Manhattan on a commercial airplane, in under 24 hours, we face the threat of newly immune superbugs. If these superbugs bypass our medical defenses, it could potentially drive life expectancy back down, crashing the system.
It's a terrifying thought. But before we get too panicked, I want to emphasize a critical point for the listeners, something the AP exam will absolutely test you on, the limitations of both these models.
That is vital. Models are theoretical frameworks. They are not absolute laws of physics. Both the DTM and the ETM have severe blind spots.
First of all, they have a massive Western bias.
Entirely.
Right.
These models were constructed in the mid-20th century by looking backwards at the specific historical data of Western Europe and North America. They arrogantly assumed that every developing country in Africa or Asia today will follow the exact same economic and cultural trajectory that England did 200 years ago. And we know that's not true. Developing nations today have access to globalized medicine and foreign aid that completely alters their timeline.
They also completely ignore migration. The DTM pretends that countries exist in a vacuum, completely sealed off from the rest of the world.
Which is a fatal flaw when analyzing modern demographics. And specifically regarding the ETM, it largely ignores the role of poverty as a primary driver of disease. It focuses on the grand timeline of epidemiological shifts, ignoring the fact that even in a highly advanced stage 4 country, poor people often die from stage 2 or 3 diseases simply because they cannot afford the expensive medical treatments that keep the wealthy alive.
That is the critical thinking the exam demands. You have to know the model, And then you have to know why the model is wrong. Speaking of being wrong, let's talk about the patron saint of being wrong in human geography. Topic 2.6 brings us to a name everyone taking this class needs to know. Thomas Malthus.
Thomas Malthus was an English Anglican minister and early economist.
Let's set the scene here. It is 1798. Malthus is living in England. The Industrial Revolution is just violently kicking off. London is filling with smog. Factories are opening, and millions of peasants are leaving the farms to cram into horrific, overcrowded urban slums. England has just entered stage 2 of the DTM, and the population is absolutely exploding.
And Malthus looks out his window at this unprecedented, chaotic population boom, and he panics. He truly believes he is witnessing the end of the world. He publishes a famous essay outlining a theory based on a very simple, terrifying mathematical discrepancy.
Right, the math of doom. He argued that population and food grow at fundamentally different speeds.
Yes, Malthus argued that human population grows geometrically or exponentially. It multiplies. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64.
Because humans love having babies, and those babies grow up quickly and have more babies.
Exactly. But, he argued, our ability to produce food can only grow arithmetically or linearly. It adds 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can only clear so many fields and plant so many seeds in a year.
So if you picture this on a graph, the human population line is a curve shooting straight up into the sky like a rocket, while the food supply line is just a slow, steady diagonal crawl. Eventually, those two lines have to cross.
That terrifying intersection is known as the Malthusian catastrophe. Malthus believed that the human population would inevitably and rapidly outpace the Earth's carrying capacity. There would simply be too many mouths and not enough grain, leading to a catastrophic collapse of civilization.
So what was his solution? Just give up?
He identified 2 ways this catastrophe could be managed. The first were preventive checks. These were actions humans could take voluntarily to lower the birth rate and slow down the rocket ship. Because he was an 18th century minister, his ideas of preventative checks were moral restraint, abstinence, and legally delaying the age of marriage so women had fewer childbearing years.
But if people didn't listen to him, which, let's be honest, they rarely do, nature would step in with positive checks. And to be clear for the listener, positive in this context does not mean good or happy.
Not at all. In Malthus's vocabulary, a positive check is any external force that actively and forcefully increases the death rate to cull the herd back down below the food line. We are talking about mass famine, horrific plagues, and brutal wars fought over dwindling resources.
And Malthus was so radically convinced of this impending doom that his political views were incredibly dark.
He was a staunch opponent of government welfare. He actually argued against providing poor relief or food aid to the starving masses in the slums. His logic, as cold as it was that giving a starving family a loaf of bread only encouraged them to survive and have another child that they couldn't feed, ultimately just speeding up the inevitable massive apocalypse.
But here is the punchline for the listener. Malthus was wrong. I mean, he published this in 1798 when the global population was maybe 1 billion people. Today, we have over 8 billion people on the planet. We blew past his doom line centuries ago, and the total global collapse hasn't happened. We still have enough food. So why did this supposedly brilliant economist miss the mark so badly?
He missed the mark because he severely underestimated human ingenuity. He could not foresee the technological miracles of the forthcoming agricultural revolutions. He assumed farming would always be a guy with a horse and a wooden plow. He didn't anticipate the invention of massive gas-powered tractors, the creation of synthetic chemical fertilizers that vastly multiplied crop yields, or the invention of refrigeration that allowed food to be harvested, stored, and transported across oceans without rotting.
He also couldn't fathom modern global trade. In his time, if a drought hit your county, you starved. Today, if a drought hits California, we just import avocados from Mexico. The local food supply isn't isolated anymore.
Furthermore, demographically, he didn't foresee the later stages of the DTM. He assumed the population rocket ship would just accelerate forever. He didn't realize that as societies urbanize, educate women, and become wealthier, the population growth naturally slows down on its own.
There is actually a geographer who specifically dunked on Malthus's entire worldview, right? Esther Boserup. She essentially flipped his theory entirely upside down.
Esther Boserup was a brilliant 20th century economist who argued that population growth does not lead to starvation. It actually spurs innovation. Her theory is essentially that necessity is the mother of invention.
So instead of a growing population being a burden, it's actually an asset.
Exactly. Boserup argued that as population pressure builds and food starts to get tight, humans don't just sit there passively and wait to starve. The threat of hunger forces them to innovate. They invent new agricultural techniques like multi-cropping, better irrigation, or genetically modified seeds to survive. Furthermore, a larger population means you literally have more human brain power working on the problem.
I love that. Boserup is the optimist to Malthus's pessimist. But I know the AP exam loves a good twist, and the twist here is that we can't count Malthus out completely. There's a whole modern school of thought called Neo-Malthusianism.
Thinkers like Paul Ehrlich brought Malthusian ideas roaring back into the mainstream in the mid-20th century. Neo-Malthusians concede that Malthus was wrong about the immediate timeline, and they acknowledge that agricultural technology delayed the crisis. But they passionately argue that his core logic that infinite growth on a finite planet is impossible is still fundamentally sound.
So if they aren't just worried about wheat and corn anymore, what are they panicking about?
They focus on holistic environmental stress. Neo-Malthusians argue that our massive population of 8 billion people is rapidly exhausting non-renewable resources like oil and rare earth metals. They point to the stripping of vital agricultural topsoil, the depletion of underground freshwater aquifers, and the overarching crisis of climate change. To a Neo-Malthusian, the catastrophe hasn't been permanently avoided, it's just been postponed. And the massive, irreversible environmental damage we are doing right now is going to be the new ultimate positive check.
Man, that is heavy. But it perfectly sets up our third slice, societal interventions and shifts, which covers topics 2.7 through 2.9. We've just spent all this time looking at the natural math of how populations grow and the philosophical debates about whether that growth will destroy us. But what happens when a government looks at that math, panics, and decides to aggressively intervene? That takes us into the fascinating, sometimes disturbing world of state-sponsored population policies, topic 2.7.
Governments generally fall into one of two polarized camps when it comes to demographic engineering, depending entirely on their current economic fears. The first camp utilizes pronatalist policies. Pro meaning for, natal meaning birth. These are aggressive policies designed to encourage citizens to have more babies and rapidly increase the population.
Why would a government want more people? Malthus would be having a heart attack.
Because these are usually countries sitting in stage 4 or stage 5 of the DTM. They have an aging population, an inverted pyramid, and they are terrified of a looming labor shortage and a collapsed pension system. They desperately need young workers and future taxpayers.
But you can't force citizens to have children. So how do they actually execute a pronatalist policy?
Because they can't force it, pronatalist policies are almost entirely incentive-based. They rely on financial bribes and social engineering. A government might offer massive tax breaks for families with 3 or more children. They mandate generous, fully paid maternity and paternity leave. They heavily subsidize the astronomical cost of daycare and early childhood education.
I mean, some of the examples from the sources are wild. Post-World War II, France implemented massive financial incentives and medals of honor for mothers simply to rebuild their decimated male population after the war's devastation. Russia, facing a severe demographic collapse, actually established a day of conception on September 12th.
Yes, the Russian government literally encouraged citizens to take the day off work, stay home, and focus on procreation. And if a couple successfully delivered a baby exactly 9 months later on their national day, the government awarded them massive prizes, everything from refrigerators to brand new cars.
And Denmark. A Danish travel company launched an advertising campaign called Do It for Denmark. The government backed it because the birth rate was so low. They subsidized romantic, tropical vacations for couples, under the statistically proven theory that couples were much more relaxed and more likely to conceive while on holiday. It sounds hilarious, but it really highlights the absolute economic terror driving these governments. They are literally paying for vacations to save their future GDP.
It is a desperate economic lever. Now, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we have antinatalist policies. Anti meaning against. These aim to drastically reduce population growth because the state leadership believes the sheer number of people is outstripping their infrastructure, their food supply, or their economic growth targets.
And these can take two forms, right? Voluntary or coercive. Let's outline the voluntary ones first, because they are much less dystopian. Egypt's a great modern example.
Yes. Egypt is facing that intense physiological density pressure along the Nile that we discussed earlier. In 2018, to curb rapid growth, the Egyptian government launched the 2 is Enough campaign. It was an entirely voluntary, persuasion-based initiative.
So no one is getting punished if they have a third kid.
Correct. Instead, the government utilized massive nationwide education campaigns on family planning. They drastically increased public access to free or heavily subsidized contraception, and most importantly, they offered targeted financial support and vocational training to impoverished women, incentivizing them to delay marriage, enter the workforce, and voluntarily limit their family size. It respects human rights and personal autonomy while attempting to shift underlying cultural norms.
But historically, there have been intensely coercive antinatalist policies that strip away that autonomy. We are outlining these purely impartially as historical facts for the exam context. We already thoroughly analyzed the demographic fallout of China's one-child policy from 1979 to 2015. To enforce that, the state used extreme coercion, massive financial fines that could ruin a family, the denial of government jobs, and in many documented rural cases, forced abortions and state-mandated sterilizations to punish unauthorized pregnancies.
And India in the 1970s is another crucial example. Under authoritarian emergency rule, the Indian government, panicked by Malthusian fears of starvation, implemented aggressive sterilization camps. They utilized intense coercion, sometimes withholding vital food rations or government licenses, unless citizens, primarily millions of poor, marginalized men, submitted to vasectomies.
Those coercive policies demonstrate the incredibly dark, extreme measures states will deploy when they fear they're losing control of the math. Now, there's a third policy lever governments can pull to manipulate their numbers, and it doesn't involve birth or death at all. It's immigration policy.
Yes. If a country cannot naturally breed the population it needs, it can simply turn the faucet of immigration on or off. Canada is the premier example of an economically targeted immigration policy. They use a highly effective, merit-based points system. They evaluate potential immigrants based on specific criteria: language proficiency, advanced education degrees, and specific professional skills that Canada currently lacks.
It's like drafting players for a sports team. We need engineers and nurses this year, so we are going to admit engineers and nurses. It allows them to surgically fill gaps in their aging workforce.
Alternatively, you have guest worker programs. Post-WWII, Western Europe, particularly Germany, utilized these heavily. They invited temporary laborers, often from Turkey or Southern Europe, to come in, do the heavy industrial labor required to rebuild the shattered economy, and send money home. The key distinction is that these programs often did not offer a clear path to permanent citizenship. The workers were expected to leave when the boom was over, allowing the host country to gain the labor without permanently altering their demographic composition.
Okay, so governments can try to manipulate the numbers from the top down. But if you want to know the single most powerful organic predictor of a country naturally lowering its birth rate and moving through the demographic transition model, it has nothing to do with state mandates. Topic 2.8 makes it very clear. It is women's empowerment. The catchphrase you need to remember is, more books, less babies.
It is the ultimate, undeniable demographic catalyst. Across every culture and every continent, when a society transitions away from traditional patriarchal gender roles where women are primarily confined to domestic labor, early marriage, and serial childbearing, to egalitarian gender roles, the demographic trajectory completely changes. And the three interconnected drivers of this change are education, employment, and healthcare.
Let's break down that domino effect, starting with education. When a developing society finally allows girls to stay in secondary school and attend university, what happens?
The first thing that happens is a dramatic delay in the age of first marriage. Educated women spend their late teens and their 20s pursuing academic qualifications and personal development rather than being forced into early marriages. By simply delaying the start of childbearing by 5 or 10 years, you mathematically reduce the total number of children a woman can biologically have. Furthermore, rigorous education equips women with the critical thinking skills to challenge deeply ingrained traditional norms that might dictate a woman's entire societal value is tied solely to her fertility.
And that education naturally unlocks the second domino, employment.
As educated women enter the formal workforce and earn their own incomes, the fundamental power dynamics within a household shift. Women gain economic independence. They are no longer entirely reliant on a husband or extended family for survival. This newfound economic autonomy translates directly into reproductive autonomy. They gain the power and the voice to make their own decisions about the timing, spacing, and total number of children they want to have. And when given the choice, the vast majority of working women choose to have fewer children so they can balance their careers and invest more resources into each individual child.
But to make that choice a reality, you need the third domino, healthcare. Specifically, access to modern contraception and family planning.
Exactly. Education and employment create the desire for smaller families, but modern reproductive health care provides the mechanism. The demographic consequence of these three factors combining is absolute. High female empowerment universally correlates with drastically lower total fertility rates, slower population growth, and a transition into stage 4 of the DTM.
It also correlates with massive drops in mortality, right? We mentioned the infant mortality rate earlier. When mothers are educated and have economic agency, the IMR plummets. They have fewer babies, but they know how to access better nutrition and medical care so those babies survive. And the maternal mortality rate, the MMR, which tracks the number of women who die from pregnancy-related complications, also drops significantly because empowered women demand and receive proper prenatal and obstetric care.
We also need to connect women's empowerment to human movement. E.G. Ravenstein was a famous 19th century geographer who developed a set of foundational laws of migration. Law 6 specifically notes a fascinating gendered difference in movement patterns. Historically, women are much more likely to migrate internally, meaning moving short distances within their own country's borders, usually from rural farming villages to urban centers. Men, on the other hand, are statistically more likely to undertake long-distance international migration.
The sources give a brilliant modern example of Ravenstein's law in action. Over the last 40 years, during China's massive, unprecedented economic and factory boom, tens of millions of young women migrated internally from impoverished rural farming villages to the booming coastal manufacturing megacities like Shenzhen.
Yes, the phenomenon of the factory girls. This massive rural-to-urban flow not only provided the cheap, plentiful labor that fueled China's rise as a global manufacturing superpower, but it also profoundly elevated the social status of those women. By earning their own money in the cities, sending remittances back home, and living independently from traditional village patriarchs, they achieved a level of economic and social empowerment that drastically lowered their fertility rates.
Which perfectly transitions us to topic 2.9, which looks at the consequence of all this success. We educated women, we lowered the birth rate, we conquered infectious diseases, and we reached the promised land of stage 4 and stage 5. The population is wealthy and stable. But surprise, it's actually a massive crisis. Aging populations.
This is the crisis of the top-heavy or inverted population pyramid we discussed earlier. You have a society with a persistently low crude birth rate, combined with a skyrocketing medically enhanced life expectancy. The mathematical result is an exploding dependency ratio, where a shrinking pool of young workers is crushed under the weight of a massive elderly population.
Let's clearly list the cascading effects of this, because it's not just a subtle demographic quirk. It is an economic earthquake that shakes every pillar of society. First up, severe labor shortages.
If you don't have enough young people graduating high school and college and entering the workforce, national productivity stalls. Factories can't find assembly line workers, tech companies can't recruit enough engineers, and small businesses can't find entry-level staff. To compete for a shrinking pool of talent, companies have to drastically raise wages, which drives up inflation. Economic growth inherently slows down unless the government intervenes.
Second, collapsing pension systems. Listeners, think about the math behind a system like Social Security in the United States.
Social Security was established in the 1930s. At that time, life expectancy was significantly lower, and the population pyramid was wide at the base. You literally had dozens of active workers paying taxes into the system to support a single retiree, and that retiree might only live another 5 or 10 years to collect those benefits.
But today, that math is entirely inverted.
Completely. Today, retirees are routinely living 20, sometimes 30 years past their retirement age, drawing benefits for decades. And because birth rates have fallen so dramatically since the baby boom, there are far fewer active workers paying into the system to support them. In many countries, the ratio has dropped from 40 workers per retiree down to 3 or 4 workers per retiree. The system becomes mathematically unsustainable and faces insolvency.
Third consequence, skyrocketing healthcare costs. The physical reality of aging is expensive. The demand for specialized geriatric care, nursing homes, joint replacements, and the management of chronic diseases like Alzheimer's places immense, compound financial strain on both government budgets and the private savings of families.
And finally, and perhaps most impactfully for the exam, are the political shifts. This is huge. In democratic systems, demographics is destiny. Elderly populations become massive, highly reliable, and highly motivated voting blocs. And people naturally vote their own self-interest.
Right. If you are 75 years old and living on a fixed pension, You don't really care about funding a new high school gymnasium or investing in long-term tech infrastructure.
Exactly. A massive elderly voting bloc will fiercely protect and prioritize state spending on healthcare, Medicare, and pension preservation. Because they are on fixed incomes, they are also highly motivated to vote aggressively against any property tax hikes or fiscal policies that might trigger inflation. This demographic reality can lead to severe political gridlock. A government is forced to spend massive, disproportionate amounts of its budget catering to the elderly, while ruthlessly cutting vital investments in the youth, education, or future infrastructure just to balance the books.
So how do these Stage 5 countries dig themselves out of this hole? How do they mitigate an aging crisis?
They essentially have three levers. We already discussed the first. They can try pro-natalist policies to bribe citizens to have more babies. But even if successful, a baby born today won't enter the workforce and pay taxes for another 20 years. It's too slow. The second lever is legislative. They can drastically raise the legal retirement age. By forcing people to stay in the workforce until they're 68 or 70, you artificially lower the dependency ratio by turning a dependent back into a worker.
But politicians hate doing that because that massive elderly voting bloc will immediately vote them out of office for touching their pensions. Look at the massive riots in France recently when they tried to raise the retirement age by just 2 years.
Exactly. Which leaves the third, fastest, and most economically viable solution. They can aggressively encourage targeted immigration. A country can instantly import millions of fully grown, educated, working-age adults who immediately start paying taxes and filling labor shortages, bypassing the 20-year waiting period of raising a child.
And that perfect, logical segue brings us to our fourth and final slice of the pie. Slice over is a human movement. We've talked about all the pressures, the environment, the economy, the aging crises. Now we have to explore what happens when those pressures cause the dam to break. Topics 2.0 through 2.12. Let's unpack why people pack up their entire lives and leave. Topic 2.0 focuses on the specific causes of migration.
To understand migration, you need to understand the foundational concept of the push-pull framework. Migration is rarely the result of a single, impulsive, isolated event. It is almost always the result of intense friction between push factors and pull factors.
Let's define those clearly.
Push factors are the negative conditions at the origin of the migrant's home that actively motivate or force someone to leave. They are the things pushing you out the door. Pull factors are the positive, attractive attributes of a specific destination that draw a migrant in.
The sources categorize these specific drivers into 5 broad areas: economic, political, environmental, demographic, and cultural. Let's start with economic, because that is the absolute heavyweight champion of migration drivers.
By far, economic motivation is the primary driver of global migration today. The economic push factors are severe poverty, a systemic lack of jobs, a collapsing local currency, or, as we discussed with agricultural density, the rapid mechanization of farming that suddenly makes rural manual labor obsolete. You simply cannot feed your family where you are.
And the economic pull factors are exactly what you'd expect. The availability of plentiful jobs, significantly higher wages, the promise of upward professional mobility, and strong, stable currencies. You move to where the money is.
Now contrast that with political migration, which is often much more sudden, urgent, and desperate. The push factors here are the outbreak of armed conflict, the rise of oppressive dictatorships, ethnic cleansing, or the severe suppression of basic civil liberties. The pull factors drawing political migrants are nations with stable, democratic governments, physical safety, and the constitutional protection of human rights.
Environmental migration is fascinating because it can happen overnight or it can take a decade.
Yes. Environmental push factors can be sudden acute shocks, like a massive Category 5 hurricane leveling an island, or a catastrophic earthquake destroying a city. Or they can be slow onset disasters, like a decade-long severe drought that slowly turns once arable farmland into useless desert, pushing farmers out. The pull factors are destinations with milder, predictable climates, fertile arable land, and secure, reliable access to freshwater resources.
Demographic and cultural drivers are the final two, and they are deeply tied to a community's identity and its resources.
A demographic push factor might be intense. Stage 2 overpopulation causing severe localized resource scarcity and extreme youth unemployment. That pushes young people towards Stage 4 nations that have more physical space and a desperate pull for young labor. Cultural pushes include religious or ethnic persecution at home, pulling people toward destinations that offer religious freedom and, crucially, pre-existing social networks of their own culture.
But here is the reality of migration. The journey from point A to point B is almost never a straight, easy line. The AP exam loves to test students on the friction of the journey itself, specifically the concepts of intervening obstacles and intervening opportunities.
An intervening obstacle is exactly what it sounds like. It is a barrier, either physical or political, that significantly hinders or completely stops a migrant from reaching their desired final destination.
Physical obstacles make sense. A massive ocean, a deadly unmapped mountain range, the sheer financial cost of buying an airplane ticket, or simply the exhaustion of walking 1,000 miles. But what about political obstacles?
Political obstacles are laws. A major historical example that frequently appears on the exam is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 in the United States. During the 19th century, thousands of Chinese migrants were strongly pulled to the U.S. West Coast by economic opportunities like the gold rush and railroad construction. But due to intense racial animosity, the U.S. government established a massive, insurmountable political obstacle by passing a law legally banning the immigration of Chinese laborers for decades. The pull was there, but the political obstacle stopped the movement.
On the flip side of that coin, you have an intervening opportunity. This is a positive circumstance encountered unexpectedly during the journey that is so good, it actually changes the migrant's final destination.
So let's illustrate this with a hypothetical but very common scenario. Imagine you are a migrant leaving South America, and your absolute ultimate goal is to reach New York City because you have family there. But the journey is long and expensive. Halfway there, you stop in a bustling industrial city in northern Mexico to work for a few months just to save up enough money to finish the trip.
Makes sense. You need cash for the next leg.
But while you are in that Mexican city, you find an incredibly well-paying job. You find an affordable apartment, you meet someone, fall in love, and integrate into a supportive, vibrant community. Suddenly, the urge to go to New York fades. The benefits of your current location outweigh the risk and cost of continuing the journey. You decide to just stay there permanently. That city was an intervening opportunity that hijacked your original migration plan.
I love that concept. It humanizes the data so well. Moving to topic 2.1, we need to draw a hard line between forced versus voluntary migration. This is a critical legal and demographic distinction for the exam. Let's tackle forced migration first.
Forced migration occurs when people are entirely compelled to move against their will due to extreme life-threatening push factors. They are not moving to find a better job. They are moving purely for biological survival, fleeing violence, intense persecution, or catastrophic disasters.
And the most significant, devastating historical example of forced migration that we have is the transatlantic slave trade.
Without question. Operating roughly from the 16th to the 19th century, driven by European imperialism and an insatiable economic demand for brutal, unpaid agricultural labor in the Americas, approximately 12.5 million African men, women, and children were kidnapped, chained, and forcibly relocated across the ocean. The demographic, cultural, and economic impacts of this massive forced movement were globally devastating, horrific, and permanent, entirely reshaping the demographics of 3 continents.
When we look at modern forced migration, it's usually the result of war or political collapse. And the AP exam requires you to know the very specific international legal distinctions between the types of people fleeing these conflicts. You need to know the exact difference between a refugee, an internally displaced person, and an asylum seeker. Let's define them.
Let's start with a refugee. A refugee is an individual who is forced to flee their home due to a well-founded fear of persecution, war, or violence. And this is the critical geographic part. They cross a recognized international border. Because they manage to physically leave the jurisdiction of their home country, they are legally eligible for special protections and aid under international law, specifically the UN Refugee Convention.
Okay, but what if they are fleeing the exact same bombed-out city, running from the exact same war, but they don't quite make it across the border?
Then they are classified as an internally displaced person, or an IDP. They are forced to flee their specific home or region, but they remain trapped within the sovereign borders of their own country.
That seems like a terrifying legal loophole to fall into.
It is incredibly dangerous. Because IDPs haven't crossed an international border, they do not have the explicit legal protection of international refugee law. They remain entirely under the jurisdiction of their own national government, which is often the very same government or military that is actively bombing them or persecuting them. Getting international aid to IDPs is notoriously difficult because outside agencies have to ask the hostile government for permission to enter.
And what about an asylum seeker?
An asylum seeker is someone who has managed to cross an international border and is actively standing on foreign soil, officially seeking formal legal protection from that destination country. They are claiming that returning home would threaten their life, and they are essentially navigating the legal process to be officially recognized and granted refugee status by the host nation.
We see forced migration on a massive, heartbreaking scale today. Look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Overnight, it forced roughly 6 million Ukrainians to flee across European borders, instantly becoming refugees. The horrific Syrian civil war, starting in 2011, created over 5 million international refugees and millions more IDPs trapped inside Syria. And massive political suppression and economic collapse in Venezuela has pushed millions of desperate citizens to flee across South America.
Now, we must vividly contrast that forced desperation with voluntary migration. Voluntary migration is a conscious, unforced choice made by the migrant to improve their economic standing or overall quality of life. The exam tests several highly specific patterns of voluntary movement. Let's break them down.
Let's run through these and let's give real-world context for each one. First pattern, transnational migration.
Transnational migration is when migrants move permanently to a new country, but they maintain incredibly deep, active, daily ties to their home country. They aren't severing their roots. They are constantly sending money back, participating in home country elections from abroad, consuming their home media, and frequently traveling back and forth. They essentially live a life bridging two distinct nations.
Second pattern, transhumance. This one is very specific.
Transhumance is an ancient, highly specific cultural and agricultural pattern. It is the seasonal, cyclical movement of pastoral nomads and their livestock. A herder will move their cattle or sheep up into the cool, grassy mountain highlands during the sweltering summer months, and then guide them back down into the warmer, sheltered valleys during the freezing winter. It is an adaptation to physical geography.
Third, internal migration.
This is simply the act of moving from one region to another entirely within your own country's borders. Moving from New York to Florida, or from a farm in Texas to a high-rise in Dallas. As E.G. Ravenstein noted in his Laws, this is by far the most common type of migration globally, simply because there are far fewer physical and legal intervening obstacles over short domestic distances.
Fourth, chain migration. I feel like this one is so crucial for understanding the cultural layout of our cities today.
It absolutely is. Chain migration is a social process. One ambitious person migrates to a new foreign city. Despite the difficulties, they find a job, secure housing, and find success. They then communicate back to their home village, essentially saying, "I figured it out, here's the path, come join me." They actively help their extended family and friends make the exact same move, providing a safety net upon arrival. Over decades, this relentless chain of communication and movement creates massive ethnic enclaves, like the vibrant Little Italy or Chinatown neighborhoods that form the cultural bedrock of major global cities.
Fifth, pattern step migration.
Step migration is movement in incremental stages, designed to reduce risk and culture shock. A migrant rarely jumps straight from a tiny, isolated farming village directly into the overwhelming chaos of a megacity like London, Tokyo, or New York. Instead, they move from the village to a regional town. They work there for a few years, save up money, and get used to urban life. Then they move to a mid-sized city. Eventually, they make the final leap to the megacity. They take it step by step.
Sixth, guest worker migration.
We touched on this with policies. This is temporary, fully legal movement purely for labor purposes. The migrants are officially invited in by a government to fill specific, acute job shortages like agricultural harvesting or construction, but they are usually legally expected to return to their home country when their visa expires or the economic boom ends.
And finally, the most important one, rural to urban migration.
This is the defining demographic shift of the modern human era. The massive, relentless movement of populations from the rural countryside into urban centers. It is the engine driving the massive, chaotic urbanization we see heavily in rapidly developing Asian and African nations today as they speed through Stage 2 and Stage 3 of the DTM.
Okay, this brings us to the final, crucial topic of the entire unit. Topic 2.1, the effects of migration. We've spent an hour talking about why people leave, but what happens in the aftermath? When millions of people move, it radically permanently reshapes both the origin country they left behind and the destination country they arrived in.
Let's analyze the political effects first. We mentioned earlier how internal migration shifts representational power. The Sun Belt migration in the United States from 1950 to roughly 1980 is the perfect historical case study.
Millions of Americans packing up and moving south.
Yes. They were pulled south by the availability of new aerospace and defense jobs. The creation of the massive interstate highway system that made the move physically possible, and crucially, the widespread invention and affordability of residential air conditioning, which suddenly made the brutal southern summers bearable. As millions of people voluntarily migrated south or west, they took their voting power with them, fundamentally and permanently shifting the balance of political power in the U.S. Congress away from the industrial Northeast and toward the conservative South and Southwest.
Migration also forces the creation of new immigration policies, often driven by fear.
It does. A rapid, highly visible influx of migrants into a destination country can frequently cause severe social friction, economic anxiety, or cultural resentment among the native-born population. Politicians often cynically respond to this anxiety by passing highly restrictive, reactionary laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act or modern demands for closed borders and massive physical walls.
Economically, the effects are massive, and they cut both ways. Let's look at the destination country first.
For a destination country, which is usually a wealthy, aging, stage 4 nation, immigrants are an absolute economic lifeline. They fill crucial labor shortages in agriculture, construction, and the service industry that native-born citizens often refuse to do. Because immigrants are overwhelmingly young, working-age adults, they provide the massive tax base necessary to keep the host country's economy running and their strained pension systems funded.
But for the origin country, the place the migrants are leaving, it's a much more complicated, mixed bag. You have this concept called brain drain.
Brain drain is devastating for a developing nation. It occurs when a poorer country loses its most highly educated, highly skilled, and vital workers, doctors, engineers, scientists, ambitious entrepreneurs to wealthier nations that can offer significantly higher salaries. The origin country pays to educate these brilliant minds, but the destination country reaps all the economic benefits of their labor. It severely cripples the developing nation's ability to modernize and build its own infrastructure.
But there is a counterweight to brain drain, and it's arguably the most powerful economic force we haven't talked about yet. Remittances.
Remittances are funds, cash sent directly by migrants working in the destination country back to their families remaining in the home country. The sheer scale of this global wealth transfer is almost impossible to comprehend. According to the World Bank, in 2022 alone, migrants sent over $766 billion in remittances.
$766 billion. That is larger than the GDP of entire countries. That is more than all the foreign aid given by all the governments in the world combined.
It is the lifeblood of the developing world. And what makes remittances so uniquely powerful is their efficiency. That $766 billion doesn't go to corrupt national governments, and it doesn't get tied up in bureaucratic foreign aid programs. It is sent via Western Union or a smartphone app directly into the pockets of a mother or a grandmother in a rural village. It is immediately spent locally to buy food, construct a sturdier house, pay for a child's school uniform, or start a small local business. It raises the standard of living at the granular, grassroots level in places like rural Mexico, the Philippines, or India.
Finally, we have to look at the cultural effects of movement. Migration is the primary unstoppable engine of global cultural diffusion.
Absolutely. Migrants do not arrive as blank slates. They bring their entire cultural identity with them, their language, their religion, their music, and their culinary traditions. This shapes and alters the destination culture profoundly over time.
The sources note a perfect example of this. Currently, 75% of American high school students choose to learn Spanish as their secondary language. That isn't an accident. That is a direct, measurable cultural effect of the large, vibrant Spanish-speaking immigrant population heavily influencing American society. We see the mass diffusion of food and media everywhere, like the explosion of authentic Indian cuisine and the massive popularity of Bollywood films in the United Kingdom.
But we also have to acknowledge that this diffusion creates intense integration challenges. When deeply distinct cultures are forced to blend rapidly within a single city, it can trigger intense, sometimes aggressive social debates over tradition, religious freedom, language preservation, and secularism. We see this frequently in European politics today regarding the integration of immigrant communities from the Middle East and North Africa. And back in the origin country, while those remittances drastically improve the financial situation, the physical absence of a parent who migrated away for a decade can severely strain, alter, and sometimes fragment the traditional family structure.
And just like that, step by step, we have traversed the absolute entirety of AP Human Geography Unit 2. We've gone from the macro scale of global population clusters down to the micro scale of a single migrant sending a Western Union transfer home. So what does this all mean for your exam? If you step back from the notes, you can see how perfectly all these pieces interlock.
Exactly. This unit gives you the tools to read the world. It arms you with predictive theoretical models like the demographic transition model and the epidemiological transition model to understand the arc of history. It equips you with the raw mathematical measurement tools, your accrued birth rates, total fertility rates, and rates of natural increase to track exactly where a country is on that arc. It provides the psychological and physical frameworks for understanding why millions of people migrate through the friction of push and pull factors. And most importantly, it shows you the profound political and economic implications of every single demographic change.
That is the ultimate synthesis. If you take away one core unifying concept from this entire hour-long deep dive, let it be this: population structures today determine economic power tomorrow.
I couldn't say it better. A population pyramid with a wide base today isn't just a chart. It is a massive hungry labor force arriving in 20 years. A declining inverted pyramid today isn't just a statistical anomaly. It is a guaranteed economic and healthcare crisis in a decade. The numbers dictate the future of the nation. Master the numbers, and you master the exam.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought. A puzzle to chew on that builds on everything we've just discussed. Something to push your critical thinking to the next level. Think about the friction between our models. We know from the DTM and our migration trends that economic opportunity is ruthlessly pulling millions of people into hyper-dense Stage 4 megacities. Humanity is desperately moving away from rural subsistence farming toward lower agricultural density and better tech. But think back to our nightmare scenario. Think about Stage 5 of the epidemiological transition model. If that stage proves true with the terrifying reemergence of highly contagious antibiotic-resistant superbugs, will those very same dense, economically triumphant urban ecumenies become the ultimate Malthusian positive check? Could the highly concentrated, incredibly crowded megacities that built our modern global economy become the very thing that forces a massive panicked reverse rural migration in the future, as humanity desperately searches for biological safety and isolation?
It is a profoundly sobering question. The city is our greatest invention, but it might also be our greatest vulnerability. And analyzing that exact type of systemic spatial paradox is exactly the kind of critical thinking that human geography demands of you.
Good luck on your AP exam in May. Trust your knowledge of the models, remember to look beyond the vocabulary to see the human stories, and keep diving deep. You've got this.